In the vast expanse of the untamed West, where mercy is as rare as rain in summer, stands a lonely cabin owned by Sarah Mitchell. Life had taught her to be wary of strangers, yet when a wounded man collapses at her doorstep one stormy night, compassion outweighs caution. She tends to his wounds, unaware that he's James King Carlton, leader of the most notorious outlaw gang in the territory. By dawn, he vanishes, leaving behind only a silver bullet. The next morning, a dozen hardened outlaws surround her home, weapons drawn, demanding answers about their missing leader. What happens when honor among thieves meets the unwavering courage of a woman who dared to show kindness to the wrong man, or perhaps the right one? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell's weathered hands trace the familiar leather binding of her family Bible, fingers lingering over the gold-leafed edges now worn to brass by generations of prayer. Morning light streamed through her cabin's eastern window, catching dust motes that danced like memories in the air. The book fell open naturally to the family records page, where neat columns of births, marriages, and deaths told the story of the Mitchells in careful, faded ink. Her own story began 48 years ago in Virginia, though the Sarah Mitchell, who'd left that genteel world behind, bore little resemblance to the woman who now called this remote cabin home. 20 years of frontier life had carved away any softness, leaving behind something stronger, like water wearing stone into grace. The last entry in the Bible, written in her own steady hand, marked her husband Thomas's passing 5 years ago. Returned to God's embrace, February 12, 1870. No mention of the fever that took him, nor of how she'd fought for 3 days straight to save him, using every herb and remedy her grandmother had taught her. Some things didn't need to be written to be remembered. Rising from her chair, Sarah moved to the herb-drying rack with practiced efficiency. The morning ritual of checking her medicinal stores helped order her thoughts as much as it prepared her for the day's work. Yarrow for bleeding, willow bark for fever, chamomile for calm. Each bundle hung in its precise place, ready to serve. Her reputation as a healer had grown slowly but surely among the scattered homesteads and ranches of the territory. Even the proud ranch wives, who'd initially dismissed her witch's brews, now sent their hands riding for miles when illness struck. The cabin itself reflected its owner's nature, modest but meticulously maintained. Thomas had built it solid, with doubled walls to ward off winter's bite and wide windows to welcome summer's breeze. Sarah had added her own touches over the years, the herb garden out back, the root cellar deep enough to store a winter's worth of preserves, the workshop where she prepared her medicines. Everything had its purpose, its place. A distant wisp of dust caught her eye through the window. Riders approaching from the direction of the Broken Spur Ranch. Already she could guess. The cause. Young Billy Hansen had taken a nasty fall from his horse 3 days ago, and she'd stitched a gash in his shoulder. Time to check those stitches and make sure infection hadn't set in. Sarah reached for her medical bag, the leather soft and supple from years of use. Inside, surgical needles nestled alongside bandages and salves, each instrument clean to gleaming. A healer's hands must be cleaner than a preacher's conscience, her grandmother used to say, and Sarah had lived by those words. As she waited for the riders to arrive, Sarah's thoughts drifted to her most recent patient, the circuit preacher, who'd stumbled in last week with a rattlesnake bite. Proud man, that one, but fear had stripped away his dignity quick enough. She'd saved his leg, though he'd probably always walk with a limp. His wife had tried to pay with their last dollars, but Sarah had refused. She had enough to live on from those who could afford her services, and she'd learned long ago that kindness had its own way of coming back around. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, and Sarah straightened her apron. Time to be about her work. The Bible lay open on the table behind her, its pages catching the morning light like a benediction. In its margins, generations of Mitchell women had penciled in their own healing wisdom alongside the holy words. Sarah had added her own notes over the years, which plants grew best in which seasons, which combinations proved most effective, which prayers brought the most comfort to the dying. The riders were close enough now that she could hear their voices, carried on the wind. Sarah took a deep breath, settling into the calm certainty that came with knowing one's purpose. She might be alone, but she wasn't lonely, not with work to do and people who needed her. These hills and the scattered souls who dwelled in them had become her congregation, and healing was her form of ministry. Dusk settled over the cabin like a heavy quilt, bringing with it the kind of silence that makes a person look twice at shadows. Sarah had just finished storing Billy Hanson's payment, 2 fresh-laid chickens and a jar of his mother's blackberry preserves, when she noticed the wind had changed. It carried the metallic tang of approaching rain, and something else, something that made the horses in the lean-to stamp restlessly. Her medicine box sat open on the table, its contents reflecting the last rays of sunlight through the window. Cedar wood and brass, it had been her grandmother's before her, each compartment sized perfectly for the tools of her trade. Sarah's fingers moved automatically through their evening ritual, checking each instrument, cleaning what needed cleaning, restocking what needed restocking. The familiar routine usually brought peace, but tonight her hands kept straying to the long drawer at the bottom, the one that held the serious things meant for serious hurts. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the hills, and Sarah found herself counting the seconds between sound and lightning. The storm was still a fair piece off, but moving fast. Experience had taught her that nights like these often brought trouble. Weather had a way of spooking horses, turning roads treacherous, making sensible men do foolish things. She added more wood to the stove, setting a pot of water to boil. Whether the night brought patience or not, hot water was never a waste. The flame caught quick in the dry cedar, and she watched it for a moment, remembering how Thomas used to say you could read the weather in a fire's behavior. This one burned straight and true, but with a restless edge to its dance. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters she'd installed last winter. Good, solid work, those shutters. They'd saved more than one window during the bad storms. Sarah moved through the cabin, checking latches, ensuring everything was battened down proper. The tin roof might make a fearsome racket in rain, but it had never leaked a drop. Her hand lingered on the rifle above the door. Thomas's old sharps, loaded, but unfired since his passing. She'd kept it clean and oiled, though, same as she kept his other tools. Everything had its purpose, even if that purpose was just remembrance. Another crack of thunder, closer now. The horses whinnied in response, and Sarah made a mental note to check their shelter before full dark. But first, she needed to secure her herbs. Some of them had been drying by the open window, taking advantage of the day's dry air. She gathered the bundles carefully, noting with satisfaction how the yarrow had dried just right, its delicate flowers still holding their shape. The first fat drops of rain began to fall as she latched the last shutter. They struck the tin roof. Like scattered shots, a prelude to the symphony to come. Sarah lit the oil lamp, its warm glow pushing back the growing darkness. The flame reflected off her grandmother's medicine box, making the brass fittings glow like buried treasure. Something moved at the edge of her vision, just a shadow, probably cast by the swaying branches outside. But Sarah had learned long ago. That probably was a poor word to bet on. She moved to the window, peering out at the gathering gloom. The rain was coming down harder now, drawing a grey curtain across the familiar landscape. A flash of lightning turned the world stark white for a heartbeat, and in that instant Sarah could have sworn she saw a figure among the trees. When darkness returned, she kept her eyes fixed on that spot, waiting for the next flash. But when it came, there was nothing there but rain and shadow. Still, she didn't move from the window immediately. Life had taught her that intuition was often wisdom. In working clothes, and right now, something didn't sit right. She found herself mentally cataloguing supplies, thinking of what she might need if, when, trouble came calling. The water on the stove began to boil, its gentle bubbling a counterpoint to the storm's growing fury. Sarah moved to take it off, The heat, but left it nearby. Better to have it and not need it, as her grandmother always said. Besides, there was comfort in the ritual of preparation, in knowing that whatever the night might bring, she was ready to face it. The knock, when it came, was barely distinguishable from the thunder. 3 soft impacts against the heavy oak door, followed by what sounded like the slide of something or someone falling against it. Sarah had been expecting trouble, but trouble usually announced itself more boldly. She took the lamp in one hand, leaving Thomas's rifle where it hung. 20 years of healing had taught her that most violence came from fear, and nothing sparked fear like a visible weapon. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she approached the door, each step measured and deliberate. "Who's there?" Her voice carried the calm authority that had steadied many a sickbed. The response was a wet, rattling cough, the kind that spoke of effort and pain. Sarah's hand was on the latch before her mind had fully decided. The healer in her had already recognized that sound. Someone in desperate need. The man practically fell through the doorway. He caught himself against the frame, leaving a dark smear on the wood. Blood, Sarah noted clinically, already reaching for him. Fresh, but not arterial. Darker, slower. His clothes spoke of quality beneath the mud and gore, but it was his eyes that caught her attention, blue as mountain lakes, fever-bright but sharp with intelligence. "Much obliged, ma'am," he managed, then his knees buckled. Sarah caught him, or rather controlled his fall. She'd learned that trick helping Thomas bring in injured horses. The man was tall but lean, and she managed to guide him to her examination. Chair near the stove. A bloodied handkerchief fell from his grip as she settled him, the fine silk incongruous against her rough-hewn floorboards. "Name's James," he offered, breath hitching. "James Carr." Another cough cut him off. "Save your strength," Sarah advised, already cutting away his sodden shirt with practiced efficiency. "Names can wait. Breathing can't." The wound was an ugly thing, a bullet track across his ribs. Not immediately fatal, but the kind that could turn bad quick without proper care. Her fingers probed gently, noting the heat of developing infection. The man, James, held remarkably still, though his breathing grew more labored. "You've some experience with this sort of thing," he observed, not a question. His voice carried the cultured tones of Eastern education beneath the pain. Sarah reached for her medicine box, selecting instruments with automatic precision. Enough to know this wasn't a hunting accident. She met his eyes steadily, and enough to know when not to ask questions. A faint smile touched his lips, gone almost before it formed. "A wise policy, ma'am." The wind howled outside as Sarah worked, the lamp flame dancing shadows across her patient's face. She cleaned the wound thoroughly, noting with approval that the bullet had passed clean through. No probing needed, a mercy for them both. Her needle flashed in the lamplight as she placed neat, careful stitches. James remained conscious throughout, his self-control impressive. Only the occasional sharp intake of breath betrayed his pain. His eyes followed her movements with an intensity that spoke of more than fever, assessing even as they burned. "You have gentle hands," he murmured as she tied off the last stitch. "Reminds me of—" He caught himself, turning the words into a cough. Sarah said nothing, just began preparing a poultice of yarrow and comfrey. Some memories were best left unspoken, especially on nights like this. She'd learned that lesson well enough with other patients, men who talked too freely under the influence of fever or her grandmother's stronger medicines. "This will help prevent infection," she explained, applying the poultice. "Though you'll need to rest for—" She stopped, noting how his hand had strayed to his empty holster. "You're safe here," she said firmly. "I don't know what trouble you're running from, and I don't need to know. But no one will harm you under my roof." Something flickered in those fever-bright eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of a truth deeper than mere words. His hand relaxed, and Sarah returned to her work, wrapping clean bandages around his torso with practiced ease. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the cabin, a different kind of peace had settled. the kind that comes with knowing one's place. In the order of things, healer and patient, shelter and sheltered, two souls brought together by chance and choice on a wild night. Midnight drew its dark curtain across the storm-racked sky as Sarah settled into her vigil. The wounded man's fever had risen, as she'd expected it might. He dozed fitfully in Thomas's old armchair, which she'd insisted was more comfortable than her examination chair for a night's rest. A quilt her mother had made, saved for special occasions, draped across his shoulders. The pocket watch she used to time her patient's medicines gleamed softly in the lamplight. It was a fine piece, heavy silver with an intricate engraving of a hunting scene. Thomas had traded 3 months' worth of leather work for it, insisting a proper healer needed proper tools. Sarah checked it now. Time for another dose of willow. "Bark tea. Your husband?" James's voice, roughened by fever but still carrying that cultured tone, startled her. His eyes were open, watching her handle the watch. "Was," Sarah replied simply, measuring herbs into a cup. 5 years gone now." James shifted, wincing at the movement. "The chair still carries his shape, and you still watch it like you're keeping it warm for him." The observation was uncomfortably perceptive for a man supposedly delirious with fever. Sarah brought him the tea, noting how his hands, despite their trembling, bore the fine calluses of someone who handled both reins and pistols regularly. "Drink," she instructed. "All of it," he complied, but his eyes never left her face. "You're not afraid," he said finally. "Most people finding a shot-up stranger on their doorstep, they'd be afraid. Fear's a luxury a healer can't afford." Sarah checked his bandages, pleased to find them still clean. "Besides, I've learned that most men, no matter their business, keep a kind of honor about them when they're being tended to." A rough laugh escaped him, ended in a cough. "Honor!" He reached for something under his vest, movements clumsy with fever. "Speaking of," he withdrew a pocket watch of his own, far finer than Sarah's. Gold, with diamonds set around its face. "Keep this safe for me. Don't want to lose track of it if the fever takes me wandering." Sarah accepted the watch, its weight surprisingly heavy in her palm. The initials J.C. were engraved on its cover in flowing script, surrounded by scrollwork that spoke of old money and older traditions. "It was my father's," James offered, then seemed to regret the admission. His eyes drifted closed again, fever pulling him back under. Sarah tucked both watches into her apron pocket, where they ticked away the night in slightly offset rhythm. Like two hearts, beating almost but not quite in time, she used the quiet moments to study her patient more carefully. His clothes, beneath the mud and blood, were expertly tailored. His boots were custom-made, the kind that cost more than most. Men earned in a month, yet he carried himself like someone used to harder work than counting money. The fever peaked near dawn, bringing with it the kind of delirium that loosens men's tongues. James muttered about trains and banks, about men named Dutch and Cole, about promises made and debts owed. Sarah caught fragments that painted a picture she carefully didn't complete. Some things were better left unknown. Instead, she bathed his forehead with cool cloths and hummed the old hymns her grandmother had taught her, the ones that seemed to ease suffering no matter the cause. Slowly, his breathing steadied the fever, beginning its retreat before the first light of dawn, when the grey fingers of morning finally crept through the windows. Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Her patient would live, assuming he had the sense to rest and heal, though something told her rest wasn't high on his list of priorities. The storm had passed, leaving behind that peculiar stillness that follows nature's fury. In her pocket, too, watches kept their separate time, marking the moments until this strange night would become just another story, best left untold. Sarah woke with a start, sunlight streaming through the windows she didn't remember opening. The chair where James had spent the night was empty, the quilt folded with military precision across its back. For a moment, she wondered if she'd dreamed the whole thing. But no, there was the bloodied handkerchief on her table, the used bandages in her medical waste bin. the lingering scent of yarrow and fever sweat in the air. His gold pocket watch was gone from her apron pocket, replaced by something else. A single silver bullet, polished to mirror brightness, rolled into her palm. The craftsmanship was exceptional. She'd seen enough ammunition in her years on the frontier to know this was no ordinary round. Intricate scrollwork decorated its base, and the silver itself had a purity that spoke of old Spanish mines. The morning air carried the fresh-washed smell of rain-soaked earth through the open window, along with something else, the fading scent of pipe tobacco, sweet and foreign. He'd sat on her porch for a while then, before leaving, watching the sunrise, perhaps, or simply gathering strength for whatever lay ahead. Sarah moved through the cabin, noting the small signs of his passing. The water bucket was full. He'd drawn fresh water before leaving. The stove had been stoked, coffee made, and a cup left cooling for her. Even the bloody bandages had been burned properly in the medical waste pit out back. A gentleman, then, whatever else he might be. She found herself standing before Thomas's gun rack, where the Sharp's rifle still hung. Below it now lay a small canvas bag that hadn't been there the night before. Inside were 5 gold double eagles, a fortune in these parts, more than enough to replace the medical supplies she'd used, to buy new ones 10 times over. She should have felt relief at such generous payment. Instead, she felt something closer to concern. The silver bullet seemed to grow heavier in her hand. She'd heard tales of a gang that used silver bullets as their calling card, the Carlton boys, they were called, named for their leader, a man who'd allegedly walked away from a fortune in Eastern banking to pursue some personal crusade in the territories. A man known for his peculiar sense of honor, his education, and his ice-blue eyes. Distant horses. Winnie caught her attention. From her window, she could see fresh hoof prints in the mud heading east. One set of tracks now, but something in her healer's intuition told her there would be more before the day was out. Men like James Carlton didn't ride alone for long. Sarah tucked the silver bullet into her apron pocket, where it nestled against her husband's watch like a secret waiting to be told. Then she began her morning routine, checking her supplies, noting what needed replacing, preparing for whatever the day might bring. But as she worked, her hands kept straying to that silver talisman, smooth and cool against her fingers. She'd made her choice the moment she'd opened her door to him, though she hadn't known it then. Whatever came next would come, and she would face it with the same steady grace she'd faced everything else life had thrown her way. After all, healing wasn't just about mending bodies. Sometimes it was about offering sanctuary to wounded souls, no matter the cost. They came with the morning mist still clinging to the ground, materializing from the pearly haze like spirits, made flesh. Sarah counted 12 riders, their horses moving with the practiced ease of animals worth more than most men's yearly wages. The lead rider wore a black hat with a silver band that caught the early light, a beacon of authority in the grey dawn. Sarah had just set her coffee to cool when she heard them. She didn't rush to the window or reach for Thomas's rifle. Instead, she smoothed her apron, checked that the silver bullet was secure in her pocket, and took a deliberate sip of her coffee. The cup didn't rattle against its saucer. Her hands were steady as summer sunshine. The riders formed a loose half-circle around her cabin, practiced enough that Sarah could tell they'd done this before. Their horses stood quiet, another sign of quality, both in the animals and their training. These weren't the wild boys who sometimes tore through territory towns, shooting up saloons and starting fights. These men moved with purpose. The man in the black hat dismounted first. His spurs rang against Sarah's porch steps with a musical clarity that suggested Spanish silver. When he removed his hat, she saw he was older than she'd expected. Perhaps 50, with steel-grey hair and a face that spoke of authority worn long and well. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying the gravel of trail dust and command. "Might we have a word?" Sarah took another sip of coffee, using the moment to study. The other riders, They were a mixed lot, some young, some old, all wearing guns, with the casual comfort of men who knew their trade. One caught her eye, a Native American whose quiet stillness reminded her of mountain cats she'd sometimes glimpse in the hills. She set her cup down carefully. "Seems you've already started speaking, sir." Her voice carried clearly through the morning air. "Though generally, where I come from, introductions precede conversation." A ripple of something, respect maybe or surprise, passed through the mounted men. The leader's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "Dutch Hawkins, ma'am, at your service." He touched the brim of his hat. "These are my associates. We're looking for a friend who might have passed this way." "Lot of men for one friend?" Sarah observed, her hand unconsciously touching the pocket where the silver bullet lay. Dutch's eyes caught the movement. Something flickered in his expression. Recognition, perhaps. "Our friend. He's important." "To us. Been riding together a long time." "Your friend wouldn't happen to wear a gold watch with diamonds round the face, would he?" Sarah asked, watching their reactions carefully. "Initials J.C. on the case." The tension in the air shifted, grew sharper. Several hands drifted closer to holsters. The Native American rider moved his horse slightly, positioning himself where he could see both Sarah and the back of the cabin. "You've seen him then?" Dutch's voice was careful now, balanced on a knife's edge between threat and hope. Sarah straightened, her spine, feeling the weight of the moment. Everything that came next would depend on her next words. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the silver bullet, holding it up so it caught the morning light. "I treated his wounds," she said simply. "He left at dawn." The effect was immediate. Shoulders relaxed, hands moved away from weapons. Dutch's face softened into genuine relief. "And his condition, ma'am?" "He'll live," Sarah replied, "assuming he follows a healer's instructions about rest and recovery, though something tells." That's not likely." A chorus of low chuckles rippled through the group. These men knew their leader well, it seemed. Dutch stepped forward, his demeanor shifting from potential threat to grateful friend. Sarah studied the rifle mounted above her door, Thomas's sharps, still untouched since his passing. Strange how its presence had always brought her comfort, yet she'd never once felt the need to reach for it. Even now, facing 12 armed men, her instincts told her the weapon would only muddy waters better left clear. "You'll have coffee, Mr. Hawkins?" she asked, her voice carrying the same steady tone she used with anxious patience. "Seems to me, men who've been riding hard might appreciate a proper cup." Dutch's eyebrows rose slightly. Behind him, his men exchanged glances that spoke volumes about the unexpected turn of events. The Native American rider, the one whose stillness spoke of wisdom, nodded almost imperceptibly. "That's right, generous of you, ma'am," Dutch replied carefully. "Though I admit, most folks aren't inclined toward hospitality when we call." Sarah met his gaze levelly. "Most folks haven't already treated your leader's wounds, Mr. Hawkins. Besides," she added, reaching for another cup, "I find coffee has a way of helping people remember their manners." A low chuckle rippled through the gang, quickly stifled when Dutch turned to look at them. But Sarah caught the shift in atmosphere, tension easing like a taut rope, finally allowed some slack. "2 sugars, if you're offering," Dutch said, accepting the cup with a courteous nod. His hands, Sarah noticed, bore the same kind of calluses as James's, a gentleman's education overlaid with years of harder living. "Your man was lucky," she said, pouring coffee for herself as well. "The bullet passed clean through. With proper care, he'll heal without complications." She paused, meeting Dutch's eyes. "Though I suspect he didn't tell you he was shot." Dutch's hand tightened fractionally on his cup. "No, ma'am, he did not. James has his pride." "Pride's a luxury that can kill a man quicker than any bullet," Sarah replied, thinking of other patients she'd lost to their own stubborn nature. "But you already know that, don't you?" The morning sun had risen higher, burning off the last of the mist. In the clear light, Sarah could better see the men who remained mounted. They were trail-worn but well-equipped, their gear speaking of quality and care. Not common bandits, then, for all that they likely had prices on their heads. James spoke. Of honor while he was fevered, she continued, watching their reactions. Kept mentioning promises made and debts owed. Now, I'm not one to pry into a patient's business, but I've lived long enough to know that honor among outlaws is rarer than gold in a stream. Dutch set his coffee cup down with deliberate care. You seem mighty certain we're outlaws, ma'am. Mr. Hawkins, I've been healing folks in these territories for 20 years. I know outlaws same as I know honest men, by their actions more than their words. She touched the silver bullet in her pocket. Your leader could have left without a word. Instead, he left payment, drew fresh water, and tended to his own bloody bandages. That tells me something about the kind of man he is, and the kind of men who follow him. A thoughtful silence settled over the porch. In the distance, a meadowlark called, its clear notes cutting through the morning air like a reminder of simpler things. If you're hunting whoever shot him, Sarah added quietly, you should know the bullet came from behind. The angle suggests someone he trusted enough to turn his back to. Dutch's expression didn't change, but something deadly flickered in his eyes. The Native American rider leaned forward slightly, exchanging a significant look with a younger man whose hand had strayed to his gun. That's valuable information, ma'am, Dutch said finally. We're much obliged. I don't take sides in other folks' quarrels, Sarah said firmly. I merely believe that if a man's going to seek justice or revenge, he should have all the facts before him. Dutch raised his cup in acknowledgement, and Sarah saw in that gesture the same quality she'd noticed in James, that peculiar blend of cultivation and danger, like a fine blade wrapped in silk. The cast-iron skillet had been Sarah's mother's wedding gift, seasoned by decades of use until it was black as midnight and smooth as silk. Now it sizzled with salt pork and potatoes, the familiar sound drawing. Eyes from every member of the gang still mounted in her yard. She'd seen that look before, on the faces of trail-worn cowboys and weary travelers. Nothing spoke of home quite like the promise of a hot meal. Mr. Hawkins, she said, moving the skillet from the heat, I've more coffee in that pot, and food. Enough to share. Seems to me your men might appreciate a proper breakfast before you ride on. She paused, adding carefully, provided they remember their guests under my roof. Dutch studied her for a long moment, then turned to his men. Boys, see to the horses. Charlie, he nodded to the Native American rider, you and Will take first watch. His tone made it clear this wasn't just about hospitality. Discipline remained, even over breakfast. 5 minutes later, Sarah's cabin had transformed. Weather-beaten men, who'd looked ready for violence, now sat with tin plates balanced on their knees, eating with the careful manners of those remembering childhood lessons in deportment. The contrast might have been amusing if it wasn't so revealing. Been a while since we had a lady's cooking, offered a grey-bearded man who'd introduced himself as Doc, though Sarah doubted he'd earned the title through medical school. Reminds me of my sister's kitchen back in Virginia. You're a long way from Virginia, Sarah observed, adding more potatoes to the skillet. The familiar weight of it in her hands was comforting, a reminder that even extraordinary situations could be handled with ordinary grace. Most of us are a long way from somewhere, Dutch replied, accepting a second helping with a nod of thanks. Though some distances aren't measured in miles, the men murmured agreement, and Sarah caught fragments of their quiet conversations, mentions of families left behind, homes sold or lost, choices made that couldn't be unmade. These weren't just James's followers, they were men bound together by something stronger than mere loyalty. Your leader, she said, keeping her voice low as she refilled Dutch's coffee. He runs deeper than most, doesn't he? Dutch's weathered face softened slightly. Known James going on 15 years now. Man could have had anything he wanted back east. Money, position, power. Instead, he chose this life. He gestured vaguely at the territory beyond her windows. Said he needed to make something right, though he never said exactly what. Sarah thought of James's fever-racked confessions, the mix of refinement and raw determination in his manner. Sometimes, she offered, a man's honor demands prices others can't understand. Speaking of honor, the young rider called Will said, From his post by the window, way he tells it, James hasn't lost a man in 3 years of riding, takes care of his own, makes sure everybody gets their fair share. And others' shares too, when needed, added Doc, glancing meaningfully at a leather bag hung by the door. One Sarah realized must contain money for the widows and families of fallen gang members. The morning light streamed through her windows, catching the steam rising from coffee cups and the silver highlights in Dutch's hair. For a moment, the scene could almost have been any gathering of trail hands or ranch workers, sharing a meal and stories before the day's work. But Sarah hadn't survived 20 years on the frontier by ignoring reality. These men, for all their current civility, were outlaws. Their very presence put her in danger. Not from them, perhaps, but from the law that would eventually come hunting them. Yet something in their manner, in the way they handled themselves in her home, told her there was more to their story than simple banditry. "Miss Sarah," Dutch said suddenly, using her name for the first time, "I want you to know we understand what you did for James. Not just the healing, but the trust you showed. That means something to men like us." The others nodded solemnly, and Sarah felt the weight of some unspoken code passing between them. She thought of the silver bullet in her pocket, wondering if this was how it started, this gradual drawing into their world of shadow and honor. The sound came first, a single horse's hoofbeats approaching at an unhurried pace. Will tensed at his post by the window, but Dutch raised his hand slightly, a subtle gesture that stilled any movement toward weapons. He'd know that particular rhythm anywhere. "King's back," Charlie said quietly from the porch, his first words since breakfast. Sarah felt the change in the air as James Carlton rode into view. He sat his horse with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, though she could see he favored his injured side. The morning sun caught his fair hair and the silver trim of his black bandana, making him look almost ethereal against the backdrop of mountain pines. He reined in at the edge of the yard, taking in the scene before him. His entire gang gathered at the cabin of a lone woman healer. For a moment, something like amusement flickered across his features, quickly replaced by a more complex emotion when his eyes met Sarah's. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I see you've met my family." The word family hung in the air, weighted with meaning. Sarah noticed how the other men straightened slightly at the term, pride and belonging evident in their bearing. "They've been excellent guests, Mr. Carlton," she replied, emphasizing his real name. "Though I admit, when you left this morning, I wasn't expecting quite so many visitors." James dismounted with careful precision, his movements betraying that the wound still pained him despite his attempt to hide it. Dutch was at his side instantly, concern evident beneath his usual stoic expression. "You're favoring that side something fierce, boss," he murmured. "I'm fine, Dutch," James replied, though he accepted the older man's supporting arm with grace. "Our healer here does excellent work." Sarah watched the interplay between them. The genuine concern, the easy familiarity that spoke of years riding together. More telling was how the other men watched their leader, not with the fearful deference she'd seen in other gangs, but with something closer to familial worry. "Speaking of which," she said, stepping forward, "I don't recall giving you permission to ride out so soon. Bullet wounds need proper time to heal, even for men who think they're made of iron." A ripple of surprised amusement ran through the gang at her bold words. James himself looked startled for a moment before a genuine smile warmed his features. "My apologies, ma'am. I had some business that couldn't wait." His expression darkened slightly. "Business concerning whoever thought it wise to put a bullet in my back." "And did you find what you were looking for?" Sarah asked, noting how his hand strayed to his gun belt at the mention of betrayal. "Not yet." James moved carefully to the porch steps, sitting down with a grace that couldn't quite hide his fatigue. "But we will, won't we, Dutch?" "Already have some ideas on that score, boss," Dutch replied. "Miss Sarah here provided some useful insights about the angle of that shot." James's eyes snapped to Sarah's face, sharp and questioning. She met his gaze steadily. "I'm a healer, Mr. Carlton. Reading wounds is part of my trade." He nodded slowly, something like respect deepening in his expression. "You continue to surprise me, ma'am. First with your kindness, then with your courage in facing my men, and now with your insights." "Life's full of surprises," Sarah replied, dryly. "Like finding oneself hosting a gang of notorious outlaws for breakfast." James laughed then, a rich sound that transformed his whole face. For a moment, she could see the man he might have been, had life led him down different paths. The Eastern gentleman, perhaps, or the respected businessman. But there was something else in his bearing now, something forged in harder fires. "About that," he said, his tone growing serious. "I owe you more than just payment for medical services, ma'am. You took a risk, sheltering me. A bigger risk, treating with my men as you have. That puts you in a certain position." Sarah felt the weight of all eyes upon her. This was more than gratitude being offered. It was a turning point, a moment when her world could shift irrevocably from its familiar axis. "And what position would that be, Mr. Carlton?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. James Carlton reached inside his vest, withdrawing a small leather-bound book that had seen better days. Its corners were worn smooth, its spine cracked from frequent use. Gold lettering, barely visible now, caught the light. "Carlton and Sons Banking, Estant 1832. "My father believed that books balance themselves," he said, turning the volume in his hands, "that if you followed the numbers, they'd always lead you to the truth. He died believing that, never knowing how his own partners had been cooking those books for years, stealing from honest folks who trusted them with their life savings." Sarah watched as he opened the book, revealing page after page of careful notations, names, dates, amounts. But these weren't bank records. They were something else entirely. "We don't rob banks, ma'am," Dutch said quietly. "We right wrongs. Every penny we take goes back to the families who lost everything to men like the ones who betrayed James's father." The Native American rider, Charlie, spoke up from his position by the door. "My people lost their lands to corrupt Indian agents, working with certain banks. King here," he nodded at James, "he helped us trace the money, prove the theft. That's why they call you King," Sarah realized. "Not because you rule them, but because of your name, Carlton King and Sons Banking." James nodded, a bitter smile touching his lips. "My grandfather's pride, that name. 3 generations of respectable bankers, until I discovered what respectability sometimes hides." He closed the book carefully. "When I tried to expose the fraud through legal channels, I found out just how deep the corruption went. Law enforcement, judges, territorial governors, all of them bought and paid for. So you chose a different path," Sarah said, understanding dawning. "One outside the law, but not outside justice. Each man here," James gestured to his gang, "has a similar story. Lost their land, their savings, their family's future to men who hide behind respectability while committing theft on a grand scale." Doc pulled out his own notebook, smaller but just as worn. "We keep records of everything, every dollar taken, every dollar returned. Had to learn banking ourselves to beat them at their own game. The silver bullets," Will added, "they're our signature. Reminder that some things are worth more than gold. Honor, justice, truth." Sarah thought of the silver bullet in her pocket, understanding now why it meant so much to them. It wasn't just a token of thanks. It was a symbol of inclusion in their cause. "Last week," James continued, shifting slightly to ease his wounded side, "we were closing in on a particular banker in Silver Creek. Man named Henderson, who's been foreclosing on farms using forged documents. We had the proof. We're ready to make things right." His face darkened. "That's when someone warned him, someone who knew our plans." "The shot that brought you to my door," Sarah concluded. "Yes." James's voice was hard now. "One of our own, bought out by the very men we're fighting against. But they underestimated us. They always do." Dutch stepped forward, his weathered face solemn. "We protect our own, Miss Sarah. Those who help us, who keep our secrets, they become family. And family means something to men like us. Sarah looked around her cabin, seeing it now through new eyes. The simple home she'd made here, the life she'd built helping others, it all felt like it was balanced on the edge of a knife. One decision could change everything. "Your code," she said finally. "Tell me more about it." James nodded to Will, who produced another small book from his saddlebag. This one was bound in red leather, its pages filled with careful handwriting. Opening it, he read, "We take only from those who have stolen first. We help those who cannot help themselves. We remember our debts, both those owed to us and those we owe to others. And above all, we protect our family, not just by blood but by choice." The words hung in the morning air, simple but powerful. Sarah realized they were waiting for her response, these men who had turned their backs on respectability to pursue a harder kind of justice. Sarah's land deed lay on the table between them, its edges worn soft with age. Thomas had paid for these 100 acres with 3 years of hard work, had built their cabin with hands that knew both calluses and care. Now James Carlton studied the document with a banker's trained eye, though his purpose was far from financial. "Your husband chose well," he said finally. "This land sits at a crossroads of sorts. Trade routes to the north, cattle trails to the south. Perfect location for a healer's practice." He paused, fixing Sarah with those startling blue eyes. Also perfect for those who might need a safe haven from time to time. "And that's what you're offering?" Sarah asked. "To make my home your gang's sanctuary?" "No, ma'am," James replied, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm offering to make you part of our family. The sanctuary would be mutual." Dutch stepped forward, laying a small map beside the deed. Red marks dotted its surface, each representing a safe house, a sympathetic ranch, a friendly trading post. "We have a network," he explained. "Good folks who understand what we're really doing. They help us. We protect them. And what happens when the law comes calling?" Sarah's question was direct, practical. James smiled slightly. "The law in these parts is selective in its attention, especially when certain influential citizens suggest where that attention should and shouldn't be directed. We have friends in surprising places," Will added. "People who've seen the truth of what we do, who help keep our work hidden from unfriendly eyes." Sarah traced the boundaries of her property on the map, noting how it filled a conspicuous gap. "In their network. And what would you expect of me, beyond discretion and the occasional medical attention?" "Information," James said simply. "You're respected in these parts, trusted. People talk to healers, tell them things they wouldn't tell others. Knowledge of who's in trouble, who's being pressured by corrupt bankers or land speculators, who might need your particular brand of justice." Sarah finished for him. "Yes." James leaned forward, wincing slightly at the movement. "But understand this, we're not asking you to compromise your principles, your healing work, your reputation for helping all who come to your door. That stays exactly as it is. We'd never ask you to turn away anyone in need." Sarah picked up her deed again, feeling its familiar weight. "And in return, protection," Dutch answered. "Not just from ordinary threats. There are powerful men in this territory who'd think nothing of forcing a lone woman off her land if it suited their purposes. With us, you'd never have to face them alone. More than that," James added softly, "you'd have family again. Men who'd ride through fire to help you if you called, a share in what we recover if you need it, and the knowledge that you're part of something larger, a chance to help right some of the wrongs in this world." The morning had grown warm, sunlight streaming through windows that had witnessed 20 years of her life's story. Sarah thought of all the patients she'd treated, all the stories she'd heard of people forced off their land, of savings stolen through legal trickery, of justice denied to those who couldn't afford to buy it. "I have conditions," she said, finally. James straightened, interest sharpening his gaze. "Name them." "First, my work comes first. If I have patients, they take priority, no matter who needs shelter." "Agreed." "Second, No violence under my roof unless there's absolutely no choice. This is a place of healing." James nodded. "We respect that." "Third," Sarah met his eyes steadily, "I want to know everything. Not just about your operations, but about who's really behind the corruption you're fighting. If I'm to be part of this, I want to understand what I'm part of." A slow smile spread across James's face. Not the charming one he'd shown earlier, but something more genuine, more dangerous. "Miss Sarah," he said, "I believe you'll fit right in with our family." The wanted poster caught Sarah's eye as she left Henderson's general store 3 weeks later. James Carlton's face stared back at her, rendered in crude woodcut that somehow managed to capture his distinctive eyes. The reward had doubled. $5,000 now, enough to tempt even honest men to dishonesty. She was studying the poster when she heard the riders approaching. 6 men, their horses lathered from hard riding, led by a sharp-faced individual whose badge marked him as a private detective from the Pinkerton agency. Sarah continued arranging her purchased medical supplies in her wagon, though her heart had begun to beat faster. "Ma'am," the detective called out, reining in beside her. "Hoping you might help us. Name's Burke, Pinkerton Detective Agency." He produced a letter with an official letterhead. "We're pursuing James Carlton and his gang. Had reports they've been seen in this area." Sarah noted the quality of their gear, the way they carried themselves. These weren't ordinary bounty hunters. They were professionals, well-funded and determined. The kind of men James had warned her about, hired by the very bankers whose crimes he was exposing. "Carlton's gang?" she asked, letting honest surprise color her voice. "Thought they worked up near Silver Creek way." Burke studied her face carefully. "You seem well informed about their movements, ma'am." "Everyone knows about the Carlton gang," Sarah replied calmly, gesturing to the wanted poster. "Especially healers. Every few months, some new bounty hunter comes through, usually looking to get patched up after trying to take them on." A slight smile touched Burke's thin lips. "We're not bounty hunters, ma'am. We represent certain financial institutions that have suffered losses due to Carlton's activities. You understand, we take a more professional approach." Sarah thought of James's words about corruption reaching into every level of law enforcement. These men might wear badges, but they served money, not justice. She lifted her medical bag, letting them see it clearly. "Well, as a healer, I treat anyone who needs help," she said firmly, "but I haven't seen your quarry, though I did treat a group of cowboys last week, moving a herd north to the railroad. They mentioned seeing riders, matching your description near Eagles Pass, heading toward Montana territory." Burke's eyes narrowed slightly. The lie had been deliberate. She knew James and his men were actually working south, investigating a land fraud scheme in Texas. Eagles Pass would send these men in the opposite direction. "That's useful information," Burke said slowly. "Though, I wonder, a woman living alone out here, you must see all sorts of travelers. Perhaps some of them have shared other stories about Carlton. We're particularly interested in any permanent camps or safe houses he might use." The threat in his voice was subtle but clear. Sarah straightened her spine, channeling every bit of the quiet authority she'd developed over years of dealing with difficult patients. "Mr. Burke," she said, her voice cooling noticeably, "in my profession, discretion is essential. People tell their doctors and their priests things they tell no one else. Breaking that trust would mean the end of my practice." She met his gaze steadily. "Besides, I'm sure men like James Carlton don't share their secrets with simple country." "Healers." One of Burke's men shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Sir, we're losing daylight. If they're headed to Eagles Pass..." Burke held Sarah's gaze a moment longer, then nodded slightly. "Thank you for your time, ma'am. Though if you do hear anything..." He handed her a card with an address in Denver. "The banks I represent are quite generous with those who help protect their interests." Sarah pocketed the card with a non-committal smile, watching as they rode away. Only when they were out of sight did she allow herself to breathe deeply, her hands shaking slightly as she climbed into her wagon. The ride home was tense, every distant sound making her wonder if Burke had seen through her deception. But as she crested the last hill before her cabin, a familiar figure sat waiting in the shadows of the pines. Charlie nodded to her silently. The gang's scouts had been watching, ready to intervene if needed. "You did well," he said simply as she drew up her horses. "King will want to know about the Pinkertons." Sarah reached into her pocket, withdrawing. "Burke's card. Tell him they're better funded than usual. And they're not just looking for him. They're mapping his network of allies." Charlie tucked the card into his vest. "You're one of us now," he said, his dark eyes warm with approval. "You understand what that means." Sarah thought of Burke's subtle threats, of the wanted poster's promise of blood money, of the choice she'd made 3 weeks ago. "Yes," she said quietly, "I believe I do." Marshal Wade Cooper's badge caught the afternoon light as he dismounted, the silver star a stark contrast to his dust-covered coat. Unlike Burke's manufactured authority, the marshal carried himself with the genuine weight of the law. A man who'd earned his position through years of service rather than purchased power. Sarah recognized him from previous visits to the territory. He'd always been fair in his dealings, known for investigating thoroughly before making judgments. That made him more dangerous than Burke in many ways. "Miss Sarah," he called out, removing his hat as he approached her porch. "Hope I'm not interrupting your day." "Not at all, Marshal." She gestured to the coffee pot visible through her window. "Just made a fresh brew, if you'd care for some." He smiled, the expression softening his weathered features. "Been riding since dawn. Coffee would be mighty welcome." Inside, Sarah poured 2 cups with steady hands, though her mind was racing. 3 days ago, James and his men had used her cabin while tracking down evidence against a corrupt cattle baron. Had they left any trace? She'd been careful, but the marshal's eyes missed little. "Heard you had some visitors recently," Cooper said casually, accepting the coffee. "Pinkerton men asking about Carlton's gang." "News travels fast," Sarah observed, keeping her tone neutral. "That it does." He studied her over the rim of his cup. "Also heard you sent them up toward Eagle's Pass." Interesting choice, considering most signs point to Carlton working south these days. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but she met his gaze calmly. "I simply passed along what I'd heard from some cowboys. Can't vouch for its accuracy." Cooper set his cup down carefully. "You know, I've been riding these territories for 15 years now. Seen all kinds of law-breaking, but Carlton, he's different. Rob a bank, but the money shows up in the accounts of farmers who lost their savings to crooked speculators. Raid a land office, but suddenly there's proof that deeds were forged." He paused meaningfully. "Almost like someone's trying to enforce a different kind of justice." "Sounds complicated," Sarah offered, "though I suppose justice often is, indeed." The marshal stood, moving to examine the wanted poster she'd taken from town, now displayed prominently on her wall as both warning and reminder. $5,000. That's a lot of money for a man who, by some accounts, is giving away most of what he takes. "By some accounts," Sarah echoed carefully. Cooper turned to face her, his expression serious. "Let me be direct, Miss Sarah. I know Carlton's gang has friends throughout the territory. Good people who help them because they believe in what they're doing. People like you, perhaps." Sarah felt the weight of the moment, the delicate balance between truth and necessity. "Are you asking me officially, Marshal?" "No," he said, after a long moment. "Because officially, I'd have to act on whatever you told me, and unofficially," he sighed, touching his badge. "Sometimes the law and justice don't ride the same trail." Sounds like a difficult position for a lawman. "It is." Cooper moved to the door, then paused. "You know, it's funny. Since Carlton started his operation, land fraud in the territory has dropped considerably. Fewer farmers losing their homes to mysterious foreclosures, fewer widows finding their husbands' life savings disappeared in banking errors." He settled, his hat back on his head, almost like someone's watching out for the little folk. "The territory's changing," Sarah offered. "Perhaps some men are learning honesty. Perhaps." Cooper smiled slightly. Though in my experience men rarely learn. Honesty without proper motivation. He stepped onto the porch. Thank you for the coffee, Miss Sarah, and if you should happen to encounter any of Carlton's people— He paused deliberately. You might mention that there's a bank examiner arriving in Silver Creek next week, one who's been taking suspicious deposits from certain territorial judges. Seems like information someone should look into. Sarah watched him mount up, understanding the gift he'd just given her, and the trust it represented. Safe travels, Marshal. Keep well, Miss Sarah. He touched the brim of his hat. And remember, officially, we never had this conversation. As his horse disappeared down the trail, Sarah sat heavily in her chair, feeling the weight of what had just transpired. The marshal's badge gleamed in her memory, a symbol not just of law, but of the complex morality they all navigated in these changing times. The old photograph lay on Sarah's table, its silver surface darkened with age, but still clear enough to tell its story. In it, a younger James Carlton stood beside his father, both dressed in the fine suits of Eastern bankers. Behind them rose the impressive facade of Carlton and Sons Banking, its columns and carved stonework speaking of old money and older traditions. Father insisted on having it taken the day I made junior partner, James said quietly. He'd arrived just after sunset, alone this time, his wound finally healed enough for easy riding. Said it marked the beginning of the next generation of Carlton bankers. That was 3 months before I found the first discrepancy in the books. Sarah studied the photograph in the lamplight. The younger James looked different, clean-shaven, hair neatly trimmed, eyes unmarked by the shadows they now carried. But there was something else. Something in his stance that suggested he'd never quite fit into that world of polished marble and pressed suits. Your father, she said carefully. He truly didn't know. No, James's voice held old pain. Charles Carlton was many things, but he was never a thief. His partners, men he'd trusted for decades, they were embezzling funds, creating false accounts, using the bank's reputation to rob honest people who trusted us. He laughed bitterly. The worst part, it was all technically legal. They'd found every loophole, greased every palm, needed to make their theft legitimate in the eyes of the law. Sarah poured him another cup of coffee, adding a splash of brandy from her medical supplies. Some wounds needed more than traditional medicine. What happened when you tried to expose them? They were ready for me. Had been watching, suspected. I might be a problem. James took a long sip of the doctored coffee. They'd already laid their groundwork, forged documents suggesting I was the one stealing, witnesses paid to swear I'd been gambling away clients' money. By the time I understood the depth of their preparation, it was too late. Your father died before I could prove the truth. Heart attack, they said. Very convenient timing. His hand strayed to his gun belt, a habit Sarah had noticed emerged when he spoke of the past. I tried working through proper channels first, hired lawyers, gathered evidence, appealed to regulatory boards, but money talks louder than truth in most men's ears. Sarah thought of the gang's code book, its careful records of wrongs righted and debts repaid. So you chose a different path. Met Dutch first, James continued, his voice warming at the memory. He'd lost his ranch to a corrupt land deal, was planning to take matters into his own hands. Had the same fire in him I felt, but he taught me something crucial. Revenge alone burns everything it touches. Justice, though. Justice can build something new from the ashes. He reached into his vest, withdrawing a folded document yellow. With age. Found this in my father's papers after his original partnership agreement. See the clause there? He pointed to a carefully worded paragraph. Bank's charter required a portion of profits be set aside for community investment, local development. His dream was to help build something lasting in these territories. Sarah read the careful copperplate handwriting, noting how it matched the entries in James's own record book. Like father, like son, both detail-oriented men who believed in accountability. The night I left Boston, James said, his voice distant. With memory, I took every record I could carry, every piece of evidence about what they'd done, rode west with nothing but my father's watch and his lessons about responsibility, spent 2 years learning the skills I'd need, tracking, shooting, riding. Then I started building the network, finding others who'd been wronged, who understood what I was trying to do. And now, Sarah asked, what happens when you've balanced all the books, righted all the wrongs? James smiled faintly. There's always another corrupt banker, another land swindle, another widow cheated of her husband's pension. But now, he gestured around her cabin, at the medical supplies organized with the same precision he brought to his own records. Now we're building something. A network of good people who watch out for each other, who stand against the kind of theft that wears a respectable face. Sarah touched the photograph gently. Your father would be proud, I think. Not of the methods, perhaps, but of the purpose behind them. Maybe. James's voice held a complex mix of emotions. Dutch says the same thing sometimes. Says following the letter of the law matters less than honoring its spirit. He met her eyes directly. What do you think, Sarah? Having seen both sides of our work now? It was the first time he'd used her given name alone, without any formal address. The question hung in the air between them, weighted with more than just philosophical implications. 2 rings lay on Sarah's table in the morning light. The first, her wedding band from Thomas, worn smooth by years of work and memory. The second, a heavy silver piece James had placed before her, bearing the subtle mark of the Carlton gang, a reminder that family came in many forms. We're moving against Henderson next week, James said quietly. The bank examiner's records confirmed what we suspected. He's been working with judges all across the territory, using legal proceedings to steal land from honest folks who can't afford to fight back. Sarah touched her wedding ring gently. And you need more than just a safe house this time. Yes. James's voice was careful, measured. What we found, it's bigger than we thought. Henderson's just the visible piece. Behind him, there's a whole network of corrupt officials, judges who take bribes to sign foreclosure orders, marshals who enforce fraudulent evictions, like a disease spreading through the territory's very bones. Sarah murmured, thinking of how illness could corrupt a body from within. Exactly. James leaned forward, his eyes intense. We need someone who can move freely between worlds. Someone respected, above suspicion, who can gather information without raising alarms. Someone who understands both healing and harm. Sarah stood, moving to her herb-drying rack. The familiar bundles swayed slightly in the morning breeze. Yarrow for bleeding, willow for pain, sage for cleansing, tools of her trade, just as James's guns and ledgers were tools of his. When Thomas died, she said slowly, I thought my life's path was set. A healer's quiet work, helping where I could, watching the world change around me. She turned back to face James. But these past months, seeing what you do, understanding the deeper wounds in our territory, it's changed something in me. I know the cost of what I'm asking, James replied. Once you're fully part of this, there's no going back. The risk? I've been at risk since the day I opened my door to you, Sarah interrupted with a slight smile. But that's not what concerns me. She picked up the silver ring, studying how it caught the light. What concerns me is whether we're truly healing anything, or just treating symptoms while the disease grows worse. James was silent for a moment, considering her words. Tell me what you mean. A healing woman learns to look for patterns, Sarah explained. When I see the same sickness in different patients, I don't just treat each one. I look for the source. Bad water, spoiled food, poisonous plants. Fix the source, and you prevent future suffering. Understanding dawned in James's eyes. You're saying we need to do more than just return stolen money and expose corrupt officials? Yes, Sarah's voice grew stronger with conviction. We need to change the system itself. Uses your father's old banking principles, perhaps. Show people there's a better way to do business, one that builds communities instead of destroying them. That's ambitious. But James was smiling now, a light in his eyes she hadn't seen before. It would take years, decades maybe. I'm not getting any younger. Sarah replied dryly. Might as well spend my remaining years on something worthwhile. James stood, moving to join her by the herb rack. It would be dangerous, more dangerous than what we've done before. We'd be threatening not just individual corrupt men, but the very systems they've built to protect themselves. Then we'll need to be smarter than they are. Sarah lifted the silver ring. Your father kept records of everything. So do you. Knowledge is power, James. Maybe it's time we started using it more strategically. He watched as she slipped the ring onto her finger alongside Thomas's band. You understand what this means, what you're committing to. I understand that some oaths are worth taking, she said quietly. Some causes worth fighting for. She met his gaze steadily. I'm not just offering you a safe house anymore, James. I'm offering you a partner. Someone who can help you see the bigger picture, who can turn your father's dreams of community investment into reality. James took her hand, studying the two rings side by side. Partners, then, in all of it. In all of it, Sarah agreed. Though, I have one condition. Name it. We start training more healers, young women who can build their own practices, create more safe houses, extend our network. The territory's growing. We need to grow with it. James's smile broadened. Building something lasting. My father would have approved. Yes, Sarah said softly, thinking of Thomas, of all the paths that had led her to this moment. I believe he would. The foundation stone for the new clinic gleamed in the morning sun, its freshly cut surface bearing a simple inscription, built by the community, for the community. Sarah traced the letters with her fingers, remembering how James had insisted on using part of the Henderson recovery money for its construction. Fighting illness is just as important as fighting corruption, he'd said, his father's banking principles finding new life in unexpected ways. Dutch supervised the construction crew, all local men who'd been helped by the gang over the years, each one now a quiet ally in their growing network. The building was taking shape quickly, its sturdy walls rising from the earth like a promise made real. The first student arrives next week, Sarah told James as he rode up, returning from another successful mission. Mary Thompson's daughter, the one whose farm you saved from foreclosure last spring. She has her mother's determination and her father's steady hands. James dismounted, taking in the construction site with evident satisfaction. And the others? 3 more confirmed, all from families we've helped, each one chosen carefully. Young, women with both skill and discretion. Sarah smiled slightly. All of them already understand the importance of keeping certain confidences, building our network through healing instead of violence, James mused. It's fitting somehow. Though, speaking of networks, he withdrew a leather portfolio from his saddlebag, found these in Henderson's private safe, letters between him and every corrupt judge in the territory, detailed records of whose palms were greased and for how much. Sarah accepted the portfolio, noting how James had organized the documents with his usual precise attention to detail. Evidence for Marshal Cooper? Some of it. James's eyes held a calculating gleam. The rest we'll use more, strategically. Amazing how cooperative certain officials become when reminded of their past indiscretions. Healing through selective pressure, Sarah observed dryly. Rather like my poultices, drawing out poison. 1 layer at a time. Dutch approached, wiping construction dust from his hands. Foundation's solid, he reported. Builder says we can start on the upper floor next week. Been thinking about those secret rooms you wanted, Miss Sarah. Figured out how to hide them in plain sight. Storage closets that ain't exactly what they seem. Sarah nodded approval. Each hidden space would serve double duty, storing medical supplies while providing emergency shelter for those in need. The clinic would become both healing center and safe house, its legitimate purpose protecting its secret one. Got word from Charlie, Dutch continued. He's established contact with 3 more tribal healers who want to exchange knowledge. Says they've got remedies we've never heard of, and they're interested in learning some of yours. Good, Sarah said firmly. Medicine shouldn't have borders, neither should justice. She watched as more wagons arrived, bringing lumber and supplies. Local farmers had donated materials, merchants had offered discounts, and even the railroad agent, now firmly in their debt after they'd exposed his superior's embezzlement scheme, had arranged for special shipping rates. "It's strange," James said quietly, standing close enough that only she could hear. "When I started this crusade, I thought it was about vengeance, about balancing ledgers and punishing the guilty. Never imagined it would become about building something new." Sarah touched the 2 rings on her finger, her old life and new purpose intertwined. "That's the thing about healing," she replied. "Sometimes the body has to break down old tissue before it can build something stronger." The morning sun climbed higher, casting their shadows long across the foundation stone. Sarah could see wagons approaching from the north, more supplies, more allies, more pieces of their expanding vision taking shape. "Henderson's arrest has stirred up quite a hornet's nest," James commented, watching the wagons. "His partners in Denver are scrambling, trying to hide their connections, but they don't realize that we already have their names," Sarah finished. "All those careful records you've been keeping." "Exactly." James smiled, the expression holding equal parts satisfaction and determination. "While they're looking for armed raiders, we're building clinics, training healers, creating a network they'll never see until it's too late. And when they do see it, by then, we'll have put down roots too deep to pull up. Every person we help becomes part of something larger, not just a gang's network, but a community looking out for its own." Sarah nodded, understanding. Like her herbs taking root in new soil, their work was growing into something self-sustaining, something that would outlast any one person's crusade. Morning glory vines climbed the clinic's walls, their purple blooms greeting the sunrise, just as they had for the past 5 years. Sarah stood on her porch, watching young Mary Thompson, now a fully trained healer, checking the herb garden she'd helped establish. Around the building's edge, fresh-faced students gathered their morning harvest, learning the same lessons Sarah had once learned at her grandmother's knee. The territory had changed in those 5 years. The changes were subtle at first. A corrupt judge suddenly retiring, a crooked banker finding reason to sell his interests and move east, land deeds mysteriously returning to their rightful owners. But like ripples spreading from a stone dropped in still water, the effects had grown wider, deeper. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" James's voice came from behind her, and Sarah turned to find him leaning against the doorframe. His hair had more silver now, but his eyes were still that startling blue, still carried that same fire for justice. "Sometimes I forget how far we've come," she admitted, "until I see all this." She gestured at the thriving clinic compound, where 3 more buildings had joined the original structure. A training center, a recovery ward, and, most importantly, a community hall that doubled as a meeting place for their ever-expanding network. "Got word from Dutch this morning," James said, joining her at the railing. "The new banking charters been approved in Denver, based on my father's original principles: community investment, transparent accounting, local oversight. First honest bank these territories have seen in a generation." Sarah smiled, remembering long nights spent poring over those old banking documents, finding ways to modernize Charles Carlton's vision for a new era. "And the board of directors? All people we trust. Ranchers, merchants, tribal leaders. Folks who understand the difference between profit and theft." He paused, a familiar glint in his eye. "Marshal Cooper's agreed to serve as security consultant after his retirement next month." The morning air carried the scent of sage and yarrow from the garden, mingling with coffee brewing in the clinic's kitchen. Sarah watched as more riders approached. Patients seeking healing, students eager to learn, and perhaps a few carrying messages meant for more discreet ears. "The network spans 3 territories now," James continued softly. 15 clinics, like this one, each with its own garden, its own students, its own way of helping those in need. More than I ever dreamed possible when I first started hunting corrupt bankers. Because you learn to heal instead of just punish," Sarah replied, touching the two rings she still wore. We both did. A young Native American woman rode up, her practice bag marking her as one of Charlie's students from the reservation clinic. She dismounted with practiced ease, calling out a greeting to Mary Thompson before joining the others in the garden. The sight warmed Sarah's heart. Barriers breaking down, knowledge flowing freely, new bridges being built. The Carlton gang's reputation has changed too, Sarah observed. These days, people whisper about guardian angels more than outlaws, about mysterious benefactors who help the deserving poor, about clinics that never turn away those in need. Let them whisper, James said with a slight smile. Mystery serves us better than notoriety ever did. He drew a familiar leather book from his vest, the gang's code book, its pages now filled with far more than just records of wrongs righted. Besides, the real work was never about reputation. Sarah nodded, understanding. The book contained their true legacy, not just accounts of money returned and justice served, but plans for future clinics, teaching methods for new healers, carefully coded lists of allies and supporters throughout the territories. A blueprint for lasting change. Speaking of real work, she said, young Billy Hansen's riding in today. Says he's ready to talk about what he overheard at the Silver Creek Bank, about those missing Indian school funds. James's expression hardened slightly. Still fighting. The same battles, just on different ground, but fighting them smarter now, Sarah reminded him. With medicine and knowledge instead of just guns and threats, building solutions that last. The morning sun climbed higher, casting their shadows across the porch where they'd first begun this journey. Sarah remembered that stormy night when a wounded man collapsed at her door, how one act of kindness had grown into something far larger than herself. Do you ever regret it? James asked suddenly. Casting your lot in with outlaws? Taking on battles that might never end? Sarah looked out at her blooming garden, at the students learning their trade, at the steady stream of people arriving, seeking help, and finding more than just healing. She thought of Thomas, wondering if he would understand how she'd found a new way to help others, a new kind of family to belong to. The only battles worth fighting are the ones that never truly end, she said finally. Justice, healing, teaching others to carry on the work. These aren't tasks that can be finished, only passed on. She touched the silver ring that marked her commitment to their cause. Besides, I'm not sure we're outlaws anymore. We've become something else, something necessary. A conscience, James suggested, for a territory still finding its way. And a reminder, Sarah added, that some things are worth fighting for, not with violence but with persistence, with wisdom, with hope. The morning glory blooms turned, their faces to the sun, their purple petals a reminder that beauty could thrive in unlikely places. Sarah saw James notice them too, saw the subtle softening in his expression that spoke of lessons learned and priorities shifted. Time for the morning clinic, she said, straightening her apron. Care to help? I hear tell some of these folk might have interesting stories to share. James offered his arm with courtly grace, a gesture that always reminded her of the banker he'd once been. Lead on, partner. After all, the best intelligence often comes from those seeking healing. Together they walked toward the clinic where Mary Thompson was already organizing the day's patients. The two rings on Sarah's finger caught the morning light, throwing off sparks like distant stars guiding travelers home. Behind them, the morning glories continued their slow climb toward the sun, finding their own path upward, one delicate tendril at a time.